Well, hello. Well, if you're here, that means you're probably here to learn the basics of video editing, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. Now, there are lots of video editing programs out there. They're big and small. There's iMovie, and there's Final Cut Pro on the Mac, and then there's Premiere that's more cross-platform. There's Sony Vegas. There's all sorts of stuff. We're not going to be looking at every single piece of video editing software ever made, because that would be ridiculous. But what we can do is take a look at a couple, mainly Final Cut Pro and a little bit of Premiere, to kind of get some basic concepts down. Now, Final Cut Pro is what we're going to use for most of the demonstration because it's what I know the best, but we'll also be taking a look at Premiere because we don't want to keep anybody out of the picture. Premiere is available on both Mac and Windows, so you'll be able to download that and follow along. So for this first lesson, we're going to be going through Final Cut, but we'll also be doing a lot of the same things in Premiere to demonstrate how you can kind of transfer your skills from one editing system to another. So to get started, let's open up a project in Final Cut. Right here I have a video that I made for Lifehacker, I think back in August, and it is how to play Super Nintendo on your iPad. And this is a Final Cut project file, and as you can see, I've got all sorts of other stuff in here. Well, the latest version of Premiere stores all its files in one folder, so if you make a project, then all your video and audio and graphics and whatever are in one folder, kind of like you see in this folder. Final Cut doesn't do that. Final Cut likes to store everything in one place because it assumes you're on a desktop machine or you have a laptop with a endlessly large hard drive. And as you probably know, that's not the case. Video fills up your hard disk really, really fast. And so it's very frustrating that Final Cut does not allow you to store project files in multiple locations. Well, that's not entirely true. Final Cut will allow you to store project files in multiple locations because, as you can see here, I've got capture scratch, audio render files, etc. in this folder. But I do that by setting up my project that way, so every single time I open Final Cut, I have to reset where all the files are stored just to match whatever project I'm working on. While this is a little frustrating and a little cumbersome, what it does allow me to do is port my project around on a hard drive and edit on multiple machines without having to reconfigure and reconnect all my files. So we'll take a look at how to do that in Final Cut so you can port things around more easily. Hopefully Apple will eventually get on the bandwagon and allow you to save things in folders. But one other thing that we should take a look at here is that the Final Cut file, is really small. And most edit files in professional editing software are really small. They're just metadata that stores everything you've done, and then all the rendering is stored in a separate folder. As you can see, audio rendering is here, render files. This one here is 3.36 gigabytes. Those are the rendered files for this project, and potentially any other projects that were set to render to that folder. But as I explained earlier, everything's in one folder. And everything's in this one project folder for just this project because I've reset it every time. Now, all these files get really big, and so they don't want to keep it in one big project file, otherwise you're going to have a huge project file that you're going to have to move around all the time. What they can do, however, is point to those files. So as you can see, this file, which is really, really tiny, points to a lot of different files. Files in Capture Scratch, which I have none because I have a footage folder I made myself to hold all the footage. As you can see here, we've got some HD footage of an iPad. And you can see that I have a lot of audio rendered files here. These are all little bits of audio that have been rendered by Final Cut. And then I've kept, I made some other music folders. I made a music folder and voiceover. So I've stored my files in, kind of my own way, but Final Cut creates their own. Anyway, you have a bunch of this stuff. This main project file points to everything else, and that's pretty standard for how most editing software works. So I'm just going to open this up, and we're going to take a look at what a Final Cut project file looks like when it's open. So here we are in Final Cut, and the project is open. That happened miraculously fast thanks to video editing because I was able to fade into the next clip, and that is an effect of video editing and something that you'll be able to do once you're editing in Final Cut or Premiere or whatever. Now this is my project here, and as you can see, I made this timeline smaller and larger so I can see more by using the slider here. So that's one thing. There are lots of little buttons like this all over the place, and there's stuff here, and there are these colors here, and there are these, what's going on with that? And then we have 2 windows for video, and one of them has video, and another one doesn't. And then there are all these files over here. So what is all this crap? That's the reason, all this stuff that you're seeing here, this is the reason why professional video editing programs are hard, and things like iMovie, which personally I find very frustrating, but are apparently easy for people. It's because of all this stuff. Like, what do you do? It's so intimidating. So we're going to take a look at what all of this stuff is in Final Cut, and then I'm going to point out a lot of it in Premiere as well. And we'll just figure out, okay, what's going on here and how can we use it to edit. So let's get started by doing one thing. This is your Windows, this is your workspace here in Final Cut, and this is the standard. Now this is a standard that worked really well for like 4:3 ratio, aspect ratio monitors when we had nice squares. But now we all have all these wide screens. We don't really do that anymore, and there are better options for widescreens because we don't need all this space for the timeline, but we do need a lot more space for the video because look how small this is. So if you go to Window and you go to Arrange, you'll find that there are a couple of options here for different editing layouts. And so I'm going to choose 2 up because that is the one that I like for widescreen because it gives me lots of space here for my stuff, and then I have enough room down here for the timeline and for my files. So let's take a look at everything we've got. Right here is the viewer, and you'll find that you have a viewer and your canvas in pretty much every editor. You're going to have this is where you can view files and preview them and decide what you want to do with them and stuff. And this is where you're actually seeing what's going on in the timeline. So as I'm scrolling around through here, you can see these are different steps in the SNES on iPad, and I can move through there in the timeline. And we're going to get to how all this video came to be in a little bit, but anyway, you can see this is what's going on here. I can also scroll around in here. I can hit play. I can scrub with this thing. And I can also set, you can see as I move this along, the time code changes. There is the time code right there. So if I were to enter, 36 instead of 46, that sets me back over here. So you can move around in all sorts of ways on the timeline. We're not going to get into what every single button does here. The viewer operates in many similar ways, but let's take a look at what some of those are. So let's say I want to open up this video file. This is in my project. I'm just going to double click on that, and that opens up in the viewer. And so I'm seeing this scaled down, but you can also, on either the viewer or the canvas, set this to be, I want this to be at 100%, so I can actually move around and see what's happening here at full resolution, which is good when you're color correcting. But I might also want to fit this into the window. There we go. And we have some tabs here. So this is the video. This has audio attached to it, so I have these stereo tracks. There's not really any actual audio, but it just has a blank audio track, and so I can make adjustments there. I can see what filters I've applied, and I also can do some motion-related stuff. So this is where you can set how fast the speed is. You can add a drop shadow to the video, which will show up if you shrink it down and put it on top of another clip or something. You can scale it, which is how you would shrink it. You can rotate it. You can crop. You can distort it. You can make it see-through by lowering the opacity. So there are all sorts of things you can do. And if you do any of those things here in the viewer, that applies globally anytime you move that clip into your timeline. So if I were to trim this clip by setting in and out points, and I'm using the I key and the O key for in and out to set that there, when I drag that onto the timeline, I'm not going to get the whole clip. I'm going to get a portion of that clip. So you can see below my mouse right there, it's kind of small. So if I were to go back and set the in point to the beginning and the out point to the end, you'll see that clip has suddenly gotten a lot bigger. So anything you do in the viewer to a clip applies globally. If you can instead open up a clip that is on the timeline, and you can see the in and out points are set here already. If I were to change that to this, you can see it updated here, but that won't apply to the clip globally. That will just apply to the clip as it stands on the timeline. I'm going to undo that really quick. So that's what happened. That's the difference between the viewer and the canvas. What happens in the canvas stays in the canvas. What happens in the viewer, so if it was opened in your in your browser, in your file browser, then that just applies to everything. So if you're trimming clips in here, make sure that you don't trim them unless you always want them to be trimmed. But of course, if you do trim a clip, let's say we are trimming this one here. There we go. That's me when I had long hair. We're going to trim it to this, and I drag it here. And then I want to extend it a little bit. I can just pull it out. Okay, so while we're on the timeline, let's take a look at what these three things do here. This is a link button, and that means the selection is linked. So if you have a link selection, it moves around together. The audio and the video move around together. If you don't, you can just select them separately and move them around. You'll have preferences about all of this. Then there is the snapping one. I'm pressing N to select and deselect that. Snapping, when you have snapping enabled, it snaps right to that or to other things, so you can get it aligned the way you want. If you don't want it to snap, you press N, and then it won't snap when you go by there. So that's really useful when moving things around. And if you hit N, you see how it just went back by itself? It's snapping. If you hit N while you're dragging, you can turn off snapping temporarily. So that's a really handy feature. Then lastly, we have this thing here, which is ripple sequence markers. And I don't know what that does, so we're not going to talk about that. Anyway, we have our sequence here. What is the sequence and what is the timeline? The timeline is the order of how things are going, and sequences are just little sets of timelines. So you'll see I have Play SNES on your iPad, and this is a sequence. And when I double-click that, it opens up this one, which is already open. And that sequence I can just edit however I want. But I can also create a new sequence. And I can put sequences inside of sequences. So I'm going to go to New, choose a sequence. There it is. Big sequence. Can't type today. There we go. I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to put a video file in there. Now, because Final Cut doesn't know what kind of sequence I want, it's asking me if I want the sequence to match the settings of the file. If you want to edit and render all your video in the same format as the file you're dragging into it, then this is a good way to just set those settings automatically. So you can just hit yes, and it will automatically set that up for you. But maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to set your sequence settings to something else. So you go to the sequence menu or hit Command 0 to bring up the settings, and you'll see, okay, this is what it already set for me. Well, there's no field dominance in this, so I don't want that. And field dominance is for interlaced video, which we don't need interlaced video if we're just doing video that isn't interlaced, and you'll have to check if your camera is, but it's basically has that sawtooth look because, well, we're not going to get into that. That's a long story. Interlacing is a big, long conversation. So you can choose all sorts of sizes here, and you can choose your codec by hitting Advanced. Now, it knows that this was an H.264 file, so we're rendering in H.264. I'd rather render in something like Apple's ProRes, so I'm going to change that to ProRes. And all of a sudden, I get this orange bar, which means that it needs to be rendered, but it's still going to let me see it. So like green and orange are both indicators of I need to render, but you know, you can still go ahead and play that video anyway. Now, the difference, the important difference is that with green, it can play fine. It's saying like I can handle this, no problem. Orange means it's kind of I don't know if I can handle this. And red means you need to render before I can play this video back. I can't. The processor on your computer can't handle it. And what we're looking at right here is this is a 1080p file in H.264, and I'm asking Final Cut to play it back on a MacBook Air. So that should give you an idea of how little effort it takes. I mean, the video editor is very capable. You can run it on pretty much the slowest hardware that you can buy, and it will work just fine. So here we are in our timeline, and we have that. Now, as I said before, you can drag another sequence onto the timeline. And there it is. There's something I've already edited on the timeline, just as its own file. And you can see here, this blue part, that's what's been rendered already. And this orange part is what has not been rendered already. And that's the video. So you can combine video, that's a really horrible freeze frame of me, with an actual sequence. that is pre-edited. And this is a good way if you want to edit a bunch of scenes in a longer piece, whether it's a movie or a, whatever. You can put together those sections and then drop them all into another sequence, and then you can combine them together so you're not working on like this hour, 2 hour long timeline. So that's really useful. So that's kind of how the timeline works, and you bring the timeline up by making a sequence and double clicking on it, and then there it is. So we're in the sequence and we want to edit. So let's put a couple of clips on here and take a look at what everything does. I'm just hitting delete in that empty space there to bring them back all together. So we've got these clips. What can we do with them? Well, we can cut them down. This one's a little long. So I can either do that by dragging on each end and cutting it down, or I can use the blade tool, which is right here. And in Final Cut, you switch between the blade and the arrow. Those are the main tools you're going to be using. A is for arrow, B is for blade. So I just hit B to select that blade tool right there. Now you go ahead and find the point you want to cut. Let's say that's a good point. Then you hit A to go back to the arrow, click on the part you want to delete, click on it, press delete, and it's gone. And then if you have empty space in the entire timeline, if there was like audio here or something else, this wouldn't work. But if it's completely empty, you can select that empty space, hit delete, and bring everything back together. That's very nice. Okay. So one thing you probably want to do with video editing is add transitions between your clips sometimes. Now, in a easy video editor like iMovie or whatever, you can just kind of put clips together and say, I want to transition here, and I want it to fade, or I want it to explode, or whatever. Those are really easy to accomplish. And so you do that by just dragging the clips together and making a decision. But in a professional environment, you have to be a little bit more manual with the operation, because the idea in professional editing software is to give you the most control possible, sometimes at the expense of your own time. Now, here we have a clip that I shortened, but we also have a clip that is in its full form. So this is from point 0. Now, in order to have a fade, imagine two film strips coming together and them overlapping, because they need to overlap for one to kind of fade in and the other to fade out. And then you get a cross dissolve. And so that's obviously a very basic, crappy way of putting that. But the idea is that these two pieces of video need to overlap in order for the fade to work. Now, if this is starting at point 0, and this one has more film that we've trimmed off of it, that means there's some extra film for this one to fade, but not for this one. So if we try to apply a cross dissolve effect, and I'm just going to do this with a command key, we'll talk about how it actually works later. You can see that kind of gets a little, that's a crappy little effect right there. That's not a whole lot is going on. And that's because there's not enough footage to work with. So what you need to do when you're applying effects in a more complex editing piece of software, you have to trim the film a little bit, and then you can apply the effect, and then you'll see a cross dissolve that actually lasts as long as you want. And there we go, we have an actual official cross dissolve right there of me and apparently my finger pressing the settings button on an iPad. So that is how you apply an effect very basically. And we'll go into more effects and all the other things that happen in video editing software a bit later, but right now let's just keep getting acquainted with our environment. Now you have your tools over here, you have your audio meters. These will show you if you're blowing out your audio. These two dots here will turn red if it gets too loud. We would do an experiment with that, but some of you are probably listening in headphones and I do not want to cause you to go deaf. So just watch these. If your audio gets too loud, then you'll know you need to turn it down. If you want to turn it down, just a quick recap, you can open up your clip in the viewer, either from here if you want to do it globally, or here if you just want to do it on the timeline. Click the audio panel, or if you're unlinked, you can just double-click on the audio, it will only open the audio, and then you can move the levels down, up and down, and you can pan from left to right if you want audio only on one ear for some reason, which you might if you have clips, if you have mono clips and you're trying to set the stereo space. So it's not unlikely, but you know, that's something for another day. It's a little bit more complicated. So basically what we have looked at so far is our viewer, where we edit stuff, our canvas, where we view what's going on in the timeline, and our actual timeline viewer, which we can see the timelines we have in all of our sequences, which are these little things here, and how those sequences can be inside of other sequences by just dragging them in, just like their footage. And you can combine edits together to make really nice packages. Now what we haven't looked at really is how files are organized. You can just kind of drag files in from the Finder in here. That works in Final Cut. It also works in Premiere. And you can organize with bins. You can create bins by going File, New, Bin, or Command B. And then you can add your footage. You can also import your footage from the File menu by going to File, Import Files. You can also import a folder and a bunch of other stuff, but we won't get to that. Now, things we'll talk about in another lesson are the effects that you can have. Now, we looked at the default transition of a cross dissolve, and you can see here it's set to cross dissolve, which is why I was able to hit Command T and automatically get that effect. But instead, if I wanted to apply some other effect, I could click in the middle right there, and then go to Effects, and then choose one. And we'll look more at that later. We can also choose video filters to color correct and do other stuff. We're going to have a whole lesson on color correction, so that will be a fun one. And then you can also do audio transitions and audio filters, and we'll take a look at audio sometime this week as well. As you can see, Premiere is getting anxious, so let's take a look at what's going on in Premiere. Here I have a couple of things already imported from the same video. Premiere is being a little bit of a not friendly piece of software, let's just say that, because Adobe decided that it would be better to suck than to give users an actual representation of what their software can do in trial mode. I don't own Premiere. I've always edited in Final Cut. I've edited in Premiere many years ago, and I kind of have an understanding of how it works now because it's very similar. And so while I'm not an expert and can't give you expert lessons on how Premiere works, I can show you how it's similar to Final Cut and pretty much any editing software there is. So as you can see, we have our timeline here. We have our bins. We have our tools on the side, and you have the arrow, and you also have the blade, which is called the razor tool here, I guess, and it's a C instead of an A, and the arrow's a V. I'm sorry, this is a C instead of a B, and this is a V instead of an A. We have our audio meters on this side. We have our two viewers. I have this thing here, which I don't really have any interest in, and I guess technically I could get rid of. And then, you know, it's pretty much the same deal, and I can drag things out. I can create, you know, a new bin. Well, I can create a new bin if I'm in the project area, I guess, when Premiere feels like it. Oh, look at me, I selected something. I can create a new bin one of these days. There we go. New bin, and organize my files. One thing Premiere does do that is really nice, though, is you can search for stuff in live mode. That's pretty great. So that's really great if you don't actually feel like organizing anything. But you can go ahead and add music and footage, and if you're following along in the trial mode of Premiere, you unfortunately can only edit in SD because that is a limitation of the trial. I didn't realize Adobe ever put limitations on the trial other than 30 days, which is very reasonable, but it's kind of hard to get a feel for software when you can't use a lot of the features you'd be using. So that's too bad. But anyway, you know, I mean, things kind of work in a similar fashion. You move stuff around on the timeline. You have an edit. You add music. If you put something on top of another clip, then that is now on top of it. You have a viewer. You have a canvas. It is pretty much the same environment, and you have effects and all of that. So we'll be looking at more similarities as we go on with the lessons on how Premiere works in comparison to Final Cut, so you can kind of get an idea of how this knowledge in Final Cut transfers over in other ways. But the idea is that everything we're going to be looking at here in the lessons today and in the rest of the week, they're all going to be things that you can do in pretty much any video editor. Things are definitely going to be different. If you're working in something like an Avid, that system's pretty specific to the way it operates, but for the most part, the principles are the same, and the principles are what we're going to be looking at this week. So thanks for joining in this video lesson. We are going to be doing, be getting our hands dirty and doing more stuff rather than just getting acquainted. But now you kind of know how things are set up and what they do and how a few things work. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.